October in Riverdale has always been a time of change. The maple leaves along Main Street turned golden and crimson, and the morning fog over the river created an almost idyllic picture of an American town. The population of 15,000 lived a quiet life where everyone knew their neighbors, and local scandals rarely went beyond gossip about divorces or drunken escapades of teenagers. Judge Norman Morrison was one of the most respected figures in the community. At 52, he had the gravitas that inspired trust and respect. His gray temples gave him dignity, and his austere suits emphasized the seriousness of his position. He had served as a district judge for 20 years, during which time he had earned a reputation as a fair but unyielding guardian of the law. His home on Elm Avenue was the embodiment of the middle-class American dream. The two-story Victorian mansion with white columns and a well-kept lawn spoke of stability and prosperity. Every morning at 7 o'clock, Norman would leave the house in his immaculately pressed suit, get into his black sedan, and drive to the district court. Eleanor Morrison greeted these mornings with her usual smile, watching her husband leave from the kitchen window. At 48, she had retained her attractiveness, although the years of married life had left their mark. She had once worked as a nurse at a local hospital, but after marriage she devoted herself to her home and charity work. Eleanor headed the Committee for Families in Need at the local Methodist church and organized annual fundraisers. Outwardly, their marriage seemed perfect. Norman and Eleanor appeared at all social events, always elegantly dressed and polite. They sat in the front row during church services, and their home was the center of the town's social life. But behind the closed doors of their mansion, there was an atmosphere of polite alienation. The problems began several years ago when Norman started staying late at work more and more often. At first, Eleanor didn't think much of it, understanding that the job of a judge requires a lot of time and effort. But gradually, she began to notice strange behavior in her husband. He became distracted, nervous, and often received phone calls after which he would fall silent for long periods of time. Their conversations became increasingly superficial, and physical intimacy virtually disappeared. Eleanor suspected that her husband had secrets, but she couldn't imagine the extent of them. She didn't know about his weekly trips to Cleveland under the pretext of professional meetings, his addiction to poker in underground clubs, or his growing debts. Norman skillfully hid his double life, but the psychological strain was gradually destroying him from within. It was at this time that Tina Collins appeared in Riverdale. The 28-year-old woman arrived from Cleveland in early September, renting a small apartment in the city center above Rosie's Cafe. She officially introduced herself as a real estate consultant, but few saw her at work. Tina was strikingly beautiful, tall, slender, with chestnut hair and piercing green eyes. She dressed tastefully but not provocatively, spoke softly, and knew how to charm people. The locals welcomed her warmly, as is usually the case in small towns. Tina quickly became a regular at Rosie's, where she drank coffee and read books, occasionally striking up small talk with other patrons. She was polite to the elderly ladies, kind to the children, and reserved but friendly with the men. No one suspected that under the name Victoria, she had been working as an escort in Cleveland for several years. Tina was smart and ambitious. She understood that working in a big city had its limitations. Too much competition, too few regular clients, too many risks. A small town offered completely different opportunities. Here, influential men felt protected from prying eyes, which meant they could afford to be more generous. Here, it was possible to build long-term relationships based not only on physical attraction, but also on psychological dependence. She studied the city with the patience of a hunter. Who was powerful here? Who was wealthy? Who was dissatisfied with their family life? Tina was good at reading people, and soon she had a detailed map of local opportunities. Judge Morrison became her main target almost immediately. Their first meeting took place at Rosie's Cafe on a rainy Thursday. Norman stopped in for a coffee on his way to court, which was unusual for him. He usually had breakfast at home. But that morning, he had quarreled with Eleanor over his late return the night before, and the atmosphere at home had become unbearable. Tina was sitting at a table by the window, reading a novel by Donna Tartt. She looked up when Norman entered, and their eyes met. A simple smile, a polite nod, nothing special. But Norman sensed something unusual about this encounter. Maybe it was the charm of a stranger. Maybe it was fatigue from family problems, but he decided to approach her. "Excuse me, are you new around here?" he asked, holding his coffee cup. "No, I just moved here," Tina replied with a warm smile. "Tina Collins. Norman Morrison. Welcome to Riverdale." They only spoke for a few minutes, but it was enough for Tina to realize she had found her goal. Norman was charmed by her intelligence and subtle humor. She didn't flirt openly, but she created an atmosphere of intimacy, making him feel interesting and desirable. In the days that followed, they began to see each other more often. At first, it was casual conversations in cafes. Then Norman began to go there on purpose, hoping to see Tina. She was always happy to see him, but never seemed pushy. Gradually, their conversations became more personal. Tina skillfully guided the conversation, encouraging Norman to open up. She sympathized with his difficulties at work, understood the complexities of family life, and admired his wisdom and experience. Norman began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: genuine interest, emotional closeness, desire. Eleanor noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He became even more distracted at home, but at the same time seemed more animated. Sometimes she noticed him smiling to himself as he read the newspaper or looked through the mail. When she tried to talk to him, he responded in monosyllables, but without his usual irritability. Something was going on, but Eleanor couldn't figure out what. Meanwhile, another important player in the drama to come appeared in town. Thomas Harris, the assistant district attorney, was an ambitious 35-year-old lawyer who saw his job as a stepping stone to a big political career. Single, attractive, and successful, he was an enviable catch for many local girls, but he remained alone, completely focused on his career. When Thomas first saw Tina at Rosie's cafe, he was struck by her. She was unlike the local women. There was something refined and mysterious about her. He began to study her with the professional scrutiny of a prosecutor. Who was she? Where had she come from? What did she do? But the more he learned, the more confused he became. Tina was cautious with Thomas. She understood that he could become a dangerous enemy if he suspected something was wrong. So she behaved very reserved with him, never giving him any reason to suspect anything. But Thomas was an experienced investigator, and his intuition told him that there was something hidden about this woman. By the end of October, the situation had become explosive. Norman was sinking deeper and deeper into his relationship with Tina, unaware of her true intentions. Eleanor felt she was losing her husband, but she didn't understand who or what she was fighting against. Thomas watched all the participants in this drama, gathering information and waiting for events to unfold. Tina patiently waited for the right moment to turn her investment in the judge into something more profitable. She knew that time was on her side. The longer their meetings continued, the more leverage she had over Norman. The town continued to live its quiet life, unaware of the passions boiling beneath its respectable surface. But change was already in the air, like a premonition of an approaching storm. November brought the first frosts to Riverdale and a sense of the approaching winter. Bare tree branches cast strange shadows on the sidewalks, and the early twilight enveloped the town in a special intimacy. It was at this time that the relationship between Norman and Tina moved to a new level. Their meetings at Rosie's cafe became regular, almost ritualistic. Every weekday at 7:30 in the morning, Norman would stop by, knowing he would find Tina at her usual table by the window. She was always happy to see him, but never showed any excessive interest. This game of hard to get only intensified his attraction. Tina was a master of psychological manipulation. She knew how to listen, ask the right questions, and create an atmosphere of trust. Gradually, Norman began to tell her about his problems, the pressure at work, and the growing alienation in his family. She sympathized, understood, and never judged. For a man accustomed to his wife's coldness and formal professional relationships, it was like a breath of fresh air. "You know, Tina," he said one day, stirring his coffee, "sometimes I feel like I'm not living my own life. It's like I'm playing a role in a play I didn't choose." Tina tilted her head, listening intently. "Tell me more about it, Norman. What makes you feel that way?" He looked out the window, where the last autumn leaves were swirling behind the glass. All these years, I thought I was doing the right things. My career, my family, my social standing. But now I realize that somewhere along the way, I lost myself. Tina reached out and lightly touched his fingers. It's never too late to find yourself again. That moment was a turning point. The physical contact, though fleeting, awakened feelings in Norman that he had long suppressed. Tina immediately pulled away, but the seed had been sown. The next day, Norman came to the cafe with a bouquet of roses. "Just because," he said, handing her the flowers. "For being such a good listener." Tina accepted the bouquet gratefully, but a predatory spark flashed in her eyes that Norman didn't notice. She knew the plan was working perfectly. The judge was caught in her web, and now all she had to do was tighten the noose. A week later, she suggested they meet somewhere else. "I have to go to Cleveland on business," she said. "Would you like to join me? I know a great restaurant." Norman hesitated for just a moment. He knew he was crossing a line, but the temptation was too great. "Okay," he said, "but this must remain between us." Their first trip to Cleveland was the beginning of a full-blown affair. Tina booked a room at the Ritz Hotel, and they spent the whole day there. She was passionate and tender, attentive to his needs, skilled in the art of seduction. Norman felt young and desired, forgetting his problems and responsibilities for a while. "I don't want this to end," he whispered as he lay next to her in bed. "Then don't let it end," Tina replied, kissing his neck. But she was already planning her next move. While Norman was in the shower, she quickly took a few photos on her phone. Nothing compromising, but enough to confirm their intimacy. Insurance was always important in her profession. Meanwhile, in Riverdale, Eleanor Morrison was struggling with growing anxiety. The changes in her husband's behavior had become too obvious to ignore. He was staying out late more often, his phone constantly vibrating with messages he read with a mysterious smile. At home, he was distracted, often lost in thought. Eleanor was not the kind of woman to turn a blind eye to problems. Her medical training had taught her to be observant, and years of married life had given her an understanding of the subtleties of human behavior. She began her own investigation. First, she checked the phone bills. There were numerous calls to an unfamiliar number, especially during working hours. Then she looked at his bank statements, cash withdrawals in unusual places, spending at restaurants and hotels in Cleveland. It all added up to a pretty clear picture. The decisive moment came at the end of November. Eleanor decided to follow her husband. She knew he was supposed to be in court, but instead she saw him get into a car with an unfamiliar woman. Even from a distance, she could tell that the woman was young and attractive. Eleanor followed them to Rosie's cafe, where she watched from her car as her husband behaved with this woman. She saw them laughing, their intimate gestures, the way he looked at her. 24 years of marriage had taught her to read Norman's body language, and now she saw what she hadn't seen in years. He was in love. The pain was physical, sharp, and piercing. But along with the pain came rage. The cold, calculating anger of a woman who had devoted the best years of her life to a man who was now betraying her for a young mistress. That evening, she greeted Norman at home with outward calm, but inside she was seething. "How was work?" she asked over dinner. "The usual," he replied without looking up from his plate. "Busy." "I'm sure," said Eleanor, and something in her tone made him look at her. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," she smiled. "What could be wrong?" But Norman sensed the tension. He knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was hiding something. A paranoid thought flashed through his mind. What if she knew? But he quickly dismissed it. Eleanor wasn't the type to make a scene. If she knew, she would have said so. Tina, meanwhile, was preparing for the next stage of her plan. A month-long affair with the judge had given her plenty of compromising material. Photos, recordings of their conversations, evidence of their meetings, but she was patient. Starting the blackmail too early could ruin everything. She needed more leverage. The opportunity presented itself in early December. Norman complained to her about financial problems. His gambling addiction had led to serious debts. "I need to find a way to get a large sum of money," he said. "Otherwise, my career could be ruined." Tina felt luck turning in her favor. "What if I help you?" she offered. "How?" I have connections in Cleveland, people who can give you a loan at a good interest rate. No questions asked, no paperwork. Norman hesitated. He knew that loans like this usually involved shady characters, but desperation made any way out seem attractive. What are the terms? We'll discuss the details later, Tina said. First, I need to know that you're willing to do whatever it takes to keep our connection a secret. The words sounded like a warning, but Norman was too in love to listen to reason. Of course, he said. I'll do whatever it takes. Tina smiled, but it was a cold smile. Good. Then we'll meet at my apartment tomorrow evening. I'll introduce you to someone. The next day, Norman arrived at Tina's place in a state of nervous excitement. Her apartment above Rosie's cafe was modestly furnished but tasteful. Soft lighting, pleasant music, a glass of wine. Everything was conducive to relaxation. Where's your friend? He asked. Plans have changed, Tina said, moving closer to him. But we can discuss other options. She hugged him, and they made love on the sofa. But this time, something was different. Tina was more aggressive, more demanding. Norman felt he was losing control of the situation. After they were done, Tina took out her phone and showed him the photos she had taken during their meetings. Beautiful pictures, don't you think? Norman froze. Why did you do that? Insurance, she said simply. It's necessary for my work. What kind of work? He asked, though he was beginning to understand. I think you can guess, Tina smiled. But don't worry, as long as you cooperate, these photos will remain our little secret. Norman realized he was trapped. The woman he had considered his savior turned out to be a predator. What do you want? Nothing special for now, Tina said. Just keep seeing me. From time to time, I may ask you for a small favor, nothing serious. And if I refuse? Tina showed him another photo, him entering her apartment. Then your wife, your colleagues, and the entire community will learn about your hobby. What do you think the consequences will be for your career? Norman knew the consequences would be catastrophic. In the conservative community of Riverdale, a scandal of this magnitude would mean the end of everything. His career, his marriage, his reputation. All right, he said quietly, but I want to know what you're ultimately after. Just a comfortable life, Tina replied, and you can give me that. Meanwhile, Thomas Harris continued his unofficial investigation. His suspicions about Tina only grew stronger. He checked her registration details, studied her financial history, and contacted her colleagues in Cleveland. The picture that emerged was far from that of a modest real estate consultant. What's more, he noticed strange behavior on the part of Judge Morrison. Norman became nervous, distracted, and often canceled meetings. Thomas began to suspect that there was a connection between these two events. He decided to proceed with caution. Direct accusations without evidence could ruin his career, but he began gathering information, preparing for the moment when he could act openly. In December, the atmosphere in Riverdale became tense. Eleanor knew about her husband's affair but didn't know what to do. Norman was trapped by Blackmail but couldn't find a way out. Tina enjoyed her power, but had no idea she was being watched. Thomas gathered evidence, preparing to strike. December covered Riverdale with a blanket of snow, turning the town into a Christmas card. Holiday lights twinkled in the windows of houses, and a large Christmas tree was erected in the main square. But beneath this idyllic picture, passions were boiling that would soon destroy the appearance of tranquility. Tina no longer hid her true intentions. Her demands on Norman became increasingly bold and specific. She was no longer satisfied with romantic dates and expensive gifts. Now she wanted information. I need details on the Henderson case, she said one evening in her apartment, lying in bed next to Norman. What Henderson case? He asked, even though he knew exactly what she was talking about. Don't play dumb, Norman. Mark Henderson, charged with drug trafficking. The case is coming up in your court next week. Norman froze. Mark Henderson was the son of a wealthy businessman, one of the most influential people in the county. His case was attracting a lot of attention, and any leak could have serious consequences. I can't discuss ongoing cases, he said. Tina turned to him, and he saw steel in her eyes. You can and you will. Or do you want me to send our photos to all the city council members? Norman knew he had no choice. He told her about the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, about how some of the evidence had been obtained illegally. Information that could help Henderson's lawyer win the case. Good, Tina smiled. See how easy it is when we work together? But Norman felt himself sinking deeper and deeper into the quicksand. Every concession made him more vulnerable. Every piece of information he handed over tied him more tightly to Tina. He realized he was becoming a puppet in her hands. Tina relished her power. She had always known that information was power, but now she had access to the very heart of the local judicial system. The Henderson case was just the beginning. She was already planning how to use her position to gain even greater advantages. The next day, she met with a man in an expensive suit at a cafe on the outskirts of town. It was David Reynolds, a private investigator from Cleveland who worked for shady clients. Is the information accurate? He asked. Straight from the judge, Tina smiled. Henderson's lawyer knows what buttons to push. Reynolds handed her an envelope with money. If this works, we'll have a long and fruitful partnership. Tina counted the bills. $5,000 for one piece of information. She knew she had struck gold. Judge Norman Morrison would be her ticket to wealth. Meanwhile, Eleanor Morrison had turned into an amateur detective. She studied her husband's every move, every phone call, every trip. Her medical background helped her organize the information and find patterns. She found out the name of his mistress, Tina Collins. She knew where she lived, where she worked, even what kind of car she drove. But the more she found out, the more questions she had. Who was this Tina? Where did she get the money for expensive clothes and jewelry? Why did she choose Norman? Eleanor was a smart woman, and her intuition told her that something was wrong. This wasn't a typical story about a middle-aged man falling in love with a young beauty. There was a deeper plan at work here. She decided to take action. Using her connections at the hospital, she gained access to the database and tried to find Tina's medical records. Nothing. Then she turned to a friend who worked at an insurance company. Again, nothing. Tina Collins was a ghost with no past. This only heightened Eleanor's suspicions. She began planning her own investigation, but she knew she needed help. And then she thought of Thomas Harris. Thomas wasn't just her husband's colleague. He was one of the most talented investigators in the county. Eleanor knew he was single, ambitious, and had a reputation for not backing down from a challenge. Perhaps he would agree to help her. She invited him to lunch under the pretext of discussing a charity event. They met at a restaurant on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Thomas, she began after they had ordered, I need your help with a delicate matter. I'm listening, Mrs. Morrison. Eleanor, please. And what I'm about to say must remain between us. Thomas nodded, intrigued. I think my husband is in a difficult situation. I suspect that a woman named Tina Collins may be blackmailing him. Thomas's eyes lit up with interest. Tina Collins? The one who rents the apartment above Rosie's cafe? Do you know her? We've met a few times. She interested me professionally. I suspect she's not who she says she is. Eleanor felt relieved. Her instincts hadn't failed her. Tell me more. Thomas shared his suspicions. He told her about his attempts to check Tina's background, about the oddities in her behavior, about the fact that she might have been involved in prostitution in Cleveland. But I don't have enough evidence for an official investigation, he admitted. If you're right about the blackmail, this could be our chance. What do you propose? An informal collaboration. You continue to watch your husband and I'll watch Miss Collins. If we find evidence of a crime, we can act officially. Eleanor agreed. She knew she was playing with fire, but the alternative, passively watching her family fall apart, was even worse. That evening, Norman came home late and in a depressed mood. The Henderson case went exactly as Tina had predicted. The defendant's lawyer used information about procedural irregularities, and the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Eleanor watched her husband during dinner. He was pale, nervous, and barely touched his food. She could see how much he was suffering, and part of her felt sorry for him, but most of her was furious. Difficult day? She asked. You could say that, he replied without looking up. The Henderson case, I hear, has been dismissed. Norman looked up sharply. How do you know? News travels fast in a small town, Eleanor replied calmly. They say the lawyer found serious irregularities in the evidence-gathering process. Norman looked at her intently, trying to understand what she was implying. Yes, there were some technical problems. I see, Eleanor said and returned to her meal. But Norman sensed that something was wrong. Eleanor was too calm, too controlled. She usually showed more interest in his work, asked questions, sympathized. Now she seemed distant, almost cold. The next day, Tina requested another meeting. She was in high spirits, celebrating the success of the Henderson case. See how well things work out when we work together? She said, raising a glass of champagne. That was the last time, Norman said. I won't be passing you any more information on cases. Tina laughed. Oh dear Norman, you don't understand how this works yet. Now I have proof not only of our affair, but also of your involvement in corruption. Leaking information on the Henderson case could cost you not only your career, but your freedom. Norman felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. He realized he was trapped with no way out. What do you want? For now, just a continuation of our cooperation. But soon I may ask for something more substantial. Like what? Like changing a sentence, or dismissing a certain case, or appoint a specific lawyer. The possibilities are endless. Norman realized that she was turning him into a corrupt judge. Every deal would make him more vulnerable, every crime more dependent on her. What if I just resign? He asked. Then I'll tell everyone about your crimes. Resignation won't save you from prosecution. No, Norman, the only way out is cooperation. Tina was right, and he knew it. He was caught in a web that was getting tighter every day. Meanwhile, Thomas Harris stepped up his investigation. He contacted his colleagues in Cleveland and learned some interesting details about Tina's past. It turned out that she had indeed worked as an escort, but not just any escort. She specialized in influential clients and often gained access to confidential information. What's more, she had been involved in several scandals, including a case of blackmailing a local politician. But there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. Thomas realized he was dealing with a professional criminal, but he also realized that she had made a mistake in choosing such a small town. It was harder to hide here and easier to trace connections. He began watching Tina, photographing her meetings and recording the license plate numbers of her visitors' cars. Gradually, he compiled a dossier on her activities in Riverdale. One of his most important discoveries was Tina's meeting with David Reynolds. Thomas knew the reputation of this private detective. He worked on the edge of the law, often crossing that line. His presence in Riverdale did not bode well. By the end of December, everyone involved in the drama was on edge. Tina was preparing for the next stage of her plan. She wanted access to bigger deals and more influential people. Norman was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, realizing that he was becoming a criminal. Eleanor and Thomas were gathering evidence, preparing for decisive action. The festive atmosphere of Christmas contrasted with the gloomy mood of the main characters. The Morrisons spent Christmas in cold silence, each spouse immersed in their own thoughts and plans. Tina spent the holidays alone in her apartment, planning her next steps. She knew she couldn't keep pressuring Norman without attracting attention. She needed a new approach, a more subtle way to get what she wanted. Thomas used the holidays to analyze the information he had gathered. He compiled a detailed dossier on Tina, including her connections, financial transactions, and suspicious meetings. He was ready to act, but he was waiting for the right moment. On December 31st, New Year's Eve, an event occurred that changed the entire balance of power. Tina called Norman to an urgent meeting. I have a proposal, she said when he arrived at her apartment. A big deal that could make us both a lot of money. I already told you, I'm not doing any more. Listen first, Tina interrupted him. It's about the Cartwright case against the city, a $10 million lawsuit. If the court rules in favor of the plaintiff, the city will have to pay huge compensation. Norman knew the case. The Cartwright family was accusing the city of negligence that led to the death of their son. It was a complicated case with many nuances. I want you to ensure the plaintiff wins, Tina continued. My partners are willing to pay $1 million for the right decision. $1 million? Norman couldn't believe his ears. Half for you, half for me. Think about it, Norman. It will solve all your financial problems. Norman knew that this offer would turn him into a criminal, but the amount was too large to ignore. I need some time to think about it. Okay, Tina agreed. But not too long, the job starts in 2 weeks. Norman left, realizing that he was facing the most important decision of his life. He could agree and gain financial freedom, but lose his soul. Or he could refuse and risk everything he had. Tina was sure he would agree. She knew people and understood their weaknesses. Greed and fear were the levers that moved the world, and she had both. But she didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know her enemies were uniting against her. She didn't know that her days in Riverdale were numbered. The new year brought new challenges and new dangers. The game had reached its peak, and now all that remained was to wait and see who would make the decisive move. January 2025 brought not only cold weather to Riverdale, but also a sense of impending disaster. Snowstorms swept the roads, and the town fell into a winter hibernation. But beneath this calm facade, passions were boiling, ready to burst out. Norman spent the first days of the new year in agonizing reflection. Tina's offer wouldn't leave him alone. $1 million could solve all his problems, pay off his gambling debts, ensure a comfortable retirement, maybe even save his marriage. But the price was monstrous, a final descent into the abyss of corruption. He studied the Cartwright v. City case file with particular care. The family of the deceased teenager was demanding compensation, accusing the municipal services of negligence. Technically, the case was complicated, with arguments on both sides. Norman could find legal grounds for any decision, but he knew that his choice would be determined not by justice, but by money. Meanwhile, Tina was growing increasingly impatient. She felt that time was against her, although she couldn't understand why. Her instincts, honed by years of dangerous work, told her that something was wrong. She began to notice strange things. Unfamiliar cars on the street, passers-by staring too intently, a feeling that she was being watched. On January 10th, she called Norman for an urgent meeting. This time, they didn't meet at her apartment, but in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was gloomy and cold, which only added to the tension. Have you made a decision? Tina got straight to the point, wrapping herself in her expensive fur coat. I need more time, Norman replied, his breath turning to steam in the frosty air. There's no time, she said sharply. The deal starts in 4 days. My partners have already put up the bail. If you don't agree, I'll be forced to take extreme measures. What measures? Tina took out her phone and showed him new photos, pictures of their meetings, including yesterday's conversation in the warehouse. By tomorrow morning, these photos and recordings of our conversations will be in the hands of a local newspaper reporter. By noon, the whole story will be on the internet. By evening, you'll be on every news program in the state. Norman knew these weren't empty threats. Tina was too professional to bluff. And if I agree? Then in a month, you'll get $500,000 in cash. No strings attached, no questions asked. And we'll continue our lucrative partnership. For how long? As long as it's profitable for both of us, Tina smiled. But her smile was as cold as the January wind. Norman realized the terrible truth. This would never end. Tina would milk him until she squeezed every last drop out of him, or until he made a mistake that would destroy him. But he had no choice. Okay, he said quietly. I'll do it. Excellent, Tina said with satisfaction. I knew you were a smart man, but deep down, she felt uneasy. The victory had come too easily. Norman had given in too quickly. Something was wrong. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Thomas stepped up their efforts. They met every day, exchanging information and planning their next moves. Thomas had compiled an impressive dossier on Tina. Photos of her meetings with shady characters, recordings of phone conversations, financial transactions. We have enough to get her arrested, he told Eleanor during their meeting at a deserted diner outside the city. But not enough to prove blackmail, Eleanor replied. We need direct evidence of her threats to Norman. I'm working on it. My contact at the phone company can get a record of their conversations. Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to expose Tina immediately and save her husband. But another part was furious at Norman for his betrayal. She wanted him to pay for his sins. "What if we let her hang herself?" she suggested. "Let her commit another crime that will ruin her for good." Thomas looked at her in surprise. There was steel in the voice of this seemingly gentle woman. "That's dangerous. If she's really blackmailing your husband, she could force him to commit a serious crime. Perhaps that's exactly what he needs," Eleanor replied coldly. "A lesson he'll remember forever." Thomas realized that dealing with an angry woman could be just as dangerous as dealing with a professional blackmailer. On January 12th, 2 days before the Cartwright trial began, an event occurred that changed the entire course of history. Eleanor decided to take matters into her own hands. She arrived at Tina's apartment late in the evening as Tina was getting ready for bed. Tina opened the door, expecting to see Norman, but instead saw an elegant, middle-aged woman in an expensive fur coat. "We don't know each other," Eleanor said, entering the apartment without invitation. "I'm Eleanor Morrison." Tina instantly recognized who she was. She had seen photos of the judge's wife, but she hadn't expected her to be so determined. "Mrs. Morrison," she said cautiously. "What an unexpected visit." "But a necessary one," Eleanor replied, removing her gloves. "We need to talk." The apartment was modestly furnished, but Eleanor noticed expensive details: a designer handbag, a Swiss watch, French cosmetics. Clearly not what a real estate consultant could afford. "About what?" Tina asked, trying to maintain control of the situation. "About my husband, about your relationship with him, about how it has to stop." Tina laughed, but it sounded forced. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't pretend," Eleanor said sharply. "I know everything. I know about your meetings, the photos, the Henderson case. I know you're blackmailing my husband." The mask of politeness slipped from Tina's face. "If you know everything, then you understand that your husband is far from an angel. He accepted my services willingly. He gave me information of his own free will." "Because you forced him!" "I didn't force him to have sex with me," Tina replied sarcastically. "It was his desire. Everything else was just a consequence." Eleanor felt a wave of rage rise within her. 24 years of marriage, 24 years of loyalty and devotion, and this was what it had come to. "How much?" she asked. "How much what? How much money do you want to disappear from our lives?" Tina smiled a predatory smile. "I'm afraid it's gone too far for a simple ransom. Your husband has already committed crimes. He's my partner, whether you like it or not. I can offer you more money than you'll ever get from your dirty schemes." "I doubt that. My plans are set for years to come. Your husband is a gold mine that will bring in income for a very long time." Eleanor realized that persuasion was useless. This woman was a professional predator who would stop at nothing. "Then I'll go to the police," she said, "and ruin your husband's career, destroy your family, become a laughing stock of the whole town." Tina was clearly enjoying the situation. "I don't think you're capable of that. You underestimate me." "Perhaps, but you underestimate me. I have information that will destroy not only your husband's career, but also his freedom. He will go to prison for corruption." Eleanor stood up and headed for the door. "We'll see each other again, Miss Collins." "Give Norman my best regards," Tina said mockingly. But when the door closed, her satisfied smile disappeared. The judge's wife's visit was an alarming sign. If she started taking action, it could complicate all her plans. Tina decided to speed things up. She called Norman and demanded an immediate meeting. "Your wife came to see me," she said when he showed up at her apartment an hour later. Norman turned pale. "What did she want?" "To convince me to leave you alone. Quite touching, actually." "And what did you tell her?" "The same thing I'm going to tell you. The game is just beginning. The Cartwright trial starts tomorrow. I expect you to make the right decision. And if I refuse?" Tina showed him a photo on her phone, his wife entering the apartment. "Then I'll tell everyone that Mrs. Morrison was my accomplice, that she knew about our relationship and covered up your crimes." Norman realized that Tina was prepared to destroy anyone who stood in her way, even innocent Eleanor. "You're a monster," he whispered. "I'm just a businesswoman," Tina replied. "And tomorrow, I expect you to take a professional approach to your work." Norman left, realizing he was trapped with no way out. Tina held him, his wife, and his future in her hands. On January 14th, the Cartwright Ver City trial began. Norman entered the courtroom feeling like a man condemned to death. He saw Eleanor in the courtroom looking at him with an expression he couldn't understand. Sympathy? Contempt? Or something else? Tina was also present in the courtroom, sitting in the back row. She watched the proceedings with professional interest, waiting for the moment of truth. The trial lasted 3 days. Lawyers presented their arguments, witnesses testified, and experts explained technical details. Norman listened to it all, knowing that his fate had already been decided, not by him, but by circumstances. On January 16th, the last day of the trial, when it was time to announce the verdict, Norman stood up and said the words that changed everything. The court grants the Cartwright family's claim and awards them $10 million in compensation. The courtroom fell silent, then erupted in applause from the plaintiff's supporters. The city's lawyers looked shocked. They were confident of victory. Tina smiled and left the courtroom. Her plan had worked perfectly, but she didn't notice that Thomas Harris was watching her closely. And she didn't know that her phone calls were being recorded and her bank transactions were being tracked. On the evening of January 16th, Tina celebrated her victory in her apartment. She opened a bottle of expensive champagne and raised a toast to the successful operation. Tomorrow, she would receive her share of the deal, and the day after tomorrow, she would start planning her next move. At 9:30, there was a knock at the door. Tina expected to see Norman. He was supposed to come for his share of the money. But instead, Eleanor Morrison was standing at the door. "We haven't finished our conversation," Eleanor said as she entered the apartment. This time she had a gun in her hand. "What are you doing?" Tina asked fearfully. "What I should have done from the beginning," Eleanor replied, locking the door. "You can't kill me. This is crazy. They'll look for me." "Who? Your accomplices?" "I doubt it. No one is looking for people like you." Tina tried to get closer to the phone, but Eleanor blocked her way. "Please," Tina begged. "We can work something out. I'll disappear from your life. Forever." "It's too late," Eleanor replied coldly. "You destroyed my family. You turned my husband into a criminal. You thought you could play with us like puppets. But I just—" A shot rang out in the silence of the January evening. Tina fell to the floor, her eyes wide with surprise. The last thought that flashed through her mind was how she had underestimated the quiet housewife from a small town. Eleanor stood over the body, holding the smoking gun in her hand. 24 years ago, she had sworn to love and protect her family. Today, she had fulfilled that vow. She took out her phone and dialed the emergency number. "Police, I want to report a case of self-defense. A woman tried to rob me and I was forced to defend myself." The lie came easily and naturally to her lips. Years of living with a man who interpreted the law on a daily basis had taught her to think like a lawyer. 10 minutes later, the apartment was full of police officers. Detective Michael Carter, who was the first to arrive at the scene, examined the body and questioned Eleanor. "Did she attack you with a knife?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied, pointing to the kitchen knife she had thoughtfully placed next to the body. "I came to talk to her about a personal matter. She attacked me. I defended myself." Carter nodded. At first glance, it looked like a classic case of self-defense. But something about the story bothered him. The news of Tina Collins's death spread through Riverdale like wildfire. The official version was that it was a botched robbery attempt, and the victim had defended herself. Norman learned of what had happened from the police officer who came to inform him about the incident involving his wife. He felt relief, horror, and admiration all at once. His quiet, submissive wife was capable of murder to save her family. Thomas Harris also heard the news and realized that his investigation was over before it began. Tina was dead, and the evidence of her crimes died with her. Justice had prevailed, but not as he had planned. Riverdale was plunged into winter tranquility, but beneath that tranquility lay secrets that would change the lives of everyone involved in the tragedy. February brought an unusual calm to Riverdale. Snow still covered the streets, but the town seemed different, as if the tragedy had changed its very atmosphere. Tina Collins's death was the main topic of conversation, but gradually interest began to wane. Detective Michael Carter couldn't get the case out of his head. 30 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that there were too many convenient coincidences in Eleanor Morrison's story. He studied the crime scene over and over again. Tina's body lay in the middle of the living room, the knife a meter away from her. The gun was registered to Eleanor, a gift from her husband 5 years ago for self-defense. Everything looked plausible, but the details bothered him. Why did she come to the victim late at night? Carter wondered aloud as he sat in his office reviewing the case file. She says she wanted to discuss a personal matter. What kind of business does the respectable wife of a judge have with an escort? Yes, by that time, the police had already discovered Tina's true profession. Connections with colleagues in Cleveland revealed her past, but that only raised more questions. Why would a woman with such a reputation live in a small town? Carter decided to dig deeper. He studied Tina's financial records, her phone calls, her meetings. Gradually, a picture of her activities in Riverdale began to emerge. Too many meetings with influential men, too much cash of unknown origin. He was particularly interested in her frequent contact with Judge Morrison. The records showed regular meetings at Rosie's Cafe and joint trips to Cleveland. Carter began to suspect that there was a relationship between the victim and the suspect's husband. Meanwhile, Eleanor lived in a strange state of calm. The murder did not cause her the expected pangs of conscience. On the contrary, she felt relieved, as if she had gotten rid of a malignant tumor. Tina was a cancer cell that was destroying her family, and Eleanor simply did what was necessary. She returned to her usual life: charity work, church, housework. Neighbors and friends expressed sympathy for the terrible accident and admired her courage. Eleanor accepted their support gratefully, playing the role of the traumatized victim. But at home, the atmosphere was tense. Norman didn't know how to treat his wife. Part of him was grateful to her for ridding him of the nightmare. Another part was horrified by her capacity for violence. The woman he had lived with for 24 years was capable of cold-blooded murder. "You saved our family," he said one day at breakfast, unable to remain silent any longer. "I did what I had to do," Eleanor replied calmly, spreading jam on her toast. "But you killed a man." Eleanor looked up at him. In her eyes, he saw the same steel that had helped her pull the trigger. Tina Collins wasn't a human being, she was a parasite, and parasites must be destroyed. Norman realized that his wife had changed forever. The quiet housewife had turned into a woman capable of making cruel decisions and taking responsibility for them. On February 5th, Carter came to the Morrisons' house with additional questions. Eleanor greeted him with outward calm, offered him coffee, and sat down in the living room across from the detective. "Mrs. Morrison, I'd like to clarify a few details," Carter began. "You said you came to Miss Collins to discuss a personal matter. Could you clarify what that was?" Eleanor paused for a moment. "She was interested in real estate in our neighborhood. I thought I could help her find something suitable." "At 9 o'clock in the evening?" "She worked during the day. I thought it would be convenient to meet after work." Carter nodded, taking notes. "And how did you get her address?" "As I understand it, you weren't close. I asked at Rosie's Cafe. She used to go there a lot." All the answers were reasonable, but Carter felt they had been rehearsed. "Tell me again what happened in the apartment." Eleanor repeated her version with frightening accuracy. Every detail was in place, every gesture described in detail. Too detailed for someone who had just experienced a traumatic event. "Weren't you scared when you fired the shots?" "I was in shock. I acted on instinct." "I see," Carter said, closing his notebook. "Thank you for your time." When he left, Eleanor allowed herself a faint smile. The detective suspected something, but he couldn't prove anything. She was too careful, too smart. But Carter didn't give up. He began digging deeper, studying the Morrison family's past, and soon he found what he was looking for. Phone records showed that Norman had been calling Tina regularly for several months. Bank statements revealed suspicious spending: restaurants, hotels, gifts. Carter realized that the judge was having an affair with the victim. This changed everything. If Eleanor knew about her husband's infidelity, she had a motive for murder. Not self-defense, but revenge. On February 10th, he summoned Eleanor to the station for further questioning. This time, the atmosphere was more formal. "Mrs. Morrison, did you know that your husband was seeing Tina Collins?" Eleanor remained calm, but Carter noticed her shoulders tense. "I don't understand what you're talking about. We have records of their phone calls, evidence of their meetings. Your husband was having an affair with the victim." The silence dragged on. Eleanor knew that denial was useless. "Yes," she said finally. "I knew." "How long?" "Several months." "And you didn't do anything?" "I tried to talk to her, to ask her to leave my family alone." Carter leaned forward. "When?" "A few days before the incident." "What did she say?" Eleanor hesitated. "That she wasn't going to break up with my husband." "And then you decided to kill her?" "No," Eleanor replied sharply. "I went to her that evening to try to work things out one more time. She attacked me with a knife." "Mrs. Morrison, there were no fingerprints on the knife." Eleanor paled. "What?" "The only fingerprints on the knife are yours. How do you explain that?" Eleanor realized she had made a mistake. In her haste, she had forgotten such details. "I picked up the knife when she fell. I wanted to make sure she couldn't attack me again. After she was shot, I was in shock. I don't remember exactly." Carter could see that her story was falling apart. "Mrs. Morrison, I think this is what happened. You found out about your husband's affair. You went to Tina Collins's house to confront her. She refused to end the relationship, possibly even threatening to expose your husband. In a fit of rage, you shot her and then staged it to look like self-defense." Eleanor was silent, realizing that the game was over. "I have another theory," Carter continued. "Perhaps it wasn't a spontaneous murder. Perhaps you planned it in advance." "Prove it," Eleanor said quietly. And Carter realized he couldn't. All the evidence was circumstantial. The motive was clear, but that wasn't enough for a first-degree murder charge. Meanwhile, Thomas Harris made a decision that would surprise many. He knew about Tina's criminal activities, knew about her blackmailing the judge. He could have provided information that would have helped Carter build a case against Eleanor. But he didn't. "Justice sometimes doesn't come from the courtroom," he mused as he destroyed the files he had gathered on Tina. "Sometimes it comes from the hands of those who have suffered the most." On February 15th, Carter was forced to close the case as self-defense. There was insufficient evidence to charge her with murder. Eleanor Morrison was officially considered a victim who had acted in self-defense, but the town knew the truth, or at least suspected it. Rumors spread quickly, and soon everyone in Riverdale knew about the judge's affair with an escort and his wife's possible revenge. Norman resigned from his position as judge a month after Tina's death. The official reason was health problems. The unofficial reason was that it was impossible to continue his career under the weight of the scandal. The Cartwright case was reviewed by a higher court as having been influenced by external factors. The family lost their right to compensation, but by then, few people cared. Eleanor continued to live in Riverdale, but her status in society had changed. Officially, she was a heroine who had defended herself against a criminal. Unofficially, she was a woman who had killed her husband's mistress and escaped punishment. March brought the long-awaited thaw. The snow melted, exposing the ground ready for new life. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching the drops of water fall from the roof. Behind her, Norman read the newspaper, avoiding her gaze. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, without looking up from the pages. "About justice," Eleanor replied. "About how sometimes it doesn't come from the courtroom." "Do you regret it?" Eleanor turned to him. There was no regret or doubt in her eyes. "No. I protected my family. I did what I had to do." Norman nodded, realizing that their marriage had changed forever. They would stay together, maintaining the appearance of a normal family. But between them would forever remain the shadow of a murder committed in the name of love. Detective Carter sometimes drove past the Morrisons' house and saw Eleanor in the garden or out shopping. She always nodded politely and smiled at him, and every time he thought about how justice has many faces. Sometimes it comes from the courtroom, sometimes from the hands of those who have given up waiting. Thomas Harris got a promotion and transferred to the state capitol. Before leaving, he ran into Eleanor on the street. "Good luck, Mrs. Morrison," he said. "Thank you, Thomas. You too." They understood each other without words. The mystery of Tina Collins died with her, and justice prevailed in its own way. Riverdale returned to its measured life. The scandal was gradually forgotten, and new events captured the attention of the townspeople. Eleanor Morrison proved that a quiet housewife can be more dangerous than any professional criminal when it comes to protecting her family. And that justice does not always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from the heart of a woman who is no longer willing to tolerate betrayal.